Because I think the people should be able to decide for themselves. Let them make the comparison.
The candidate.
Now, all he does is hold him up for a couple of minutes till he can call us, get a bet down on the winner. Then he releases the results to the bookies. We clean up on a race that's already been run.
The sting.
All right, smile.
Hey, this is
hold
beautiful.
it. Yes.
Yeah, hold it level.
Wonderful. Okay, now I want to take Cal and Beth, okay?
Ordinary people. What do these three films have in common? Robert Redford as either star or director, and the varied film career of Robert Redford, classic star, maverick director, is the focus of the special edition of Siskel and Ebert. And every so often, Roger and I like to focus on one actor or filmmaker who we think has established a major career and is worthy of special attention, a full half hour of our show. There are going to be lots of video rental suggestions in this special show on Robert Redford. I'm Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune.
And I'm Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times. And you're right, Gene, that Redford is one of the few people who has had conventional success at the box office with dollars, which is all that Hollywood really looks at, and at the same time has led an almost completely separate existence as a director and as a sponsor of independent films outside the system. Redford attended the University of Colorado on an athletic scholarship, and then he went to spend some time in Paris trying to be a painter. Redford first found himself as an actor on the stage starting out in the late 1950s. At first, he worked infrequently in films. His debut was in War Hunt in 1962, and his first important role was opposite Natalie Wood in This Property is Condemned in 1966. He got good billing from then on, right from the start of his career, in movies like Inside Daisy Clover and The Chase, where he appeared as an escaped convict. And he had an early hit with Barefoot in the Park in 1967.
Paul, tell me you're not sorry we got married.
After 40 minutes, let's give it a couple of hours first.
But Robert Redford truly deserved that star billing after he made Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969. Redford and Paul Newman created one of the most famous pairings in movie history.
Listen, I don't mean to be a sore loser, but when it's done, if I'm dead, kill him. Love to.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was a film whose outlaw personalities perfectly suited the anarchic spirit of the late 1960s. And it was the first of many films that demonstrated Redford's almost uncanny ability to pick projects in sync with the mood of the time.
I think it's interesting to try and figure out why this was the film that catapulted him into superstardom. And I think one of the things had to do with he held his own against Paul Newman, and he seemed younger than Paul Newman. And I think that people were saying, hey, who is this other guy? When I mean, I adore Newman, and here's this other guy, and he's even more glamorous.
You know, I was on the set of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid when they were making it. It was the first time I met either Paul Newman or Robert Redford. And at the time, there was a feeling that the film was going to go right into the basement. It was a Western. Everybody was going to Easy Rider. They were going to 2001. It seemed like it was completely out of its time, and that's why it surprised people so much that Butch and Sundance, the Sundance Kid, seemed very contemporary when the movie came out.
I think that if you mentioned Easy Rider. I think if you can think about the film as sort of a mainstream version of Easy Rider, the two rebels, and here is something that's more palatable for the mainstream culture, and it was a mainstream hit. Moving along, obviously, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid from 1969 was a turning point in Robert Redford's career, but a bigger turning point was what Redford did with his newfound power. Instead of making mindless romances, which he could have done for years, he caught the wave of a new American cinema that erupted in the late 60s, playing anti-heroes like the self-absorbed skier and downhill racer from 1969, in which he also served as executive producer.
I used to come from New York, and I'd have my skis in a case and my boots, and they'd say, "Where are they?" I'd say, "Skis." "Skis," they'd say. "Where are you jumping?" Now they say, "I saw your picture in Sports Illustrated."
In The Candidate from 1972, Redford played another good-looking guy who was alive on the outside but dying on the inside. At the very end of the film, after he wins the U.S. Senate race in California, he asks his campaign manager, Peter Boyle, a shocking question.
Marvin, what do we do now?
Wait a minute, what?
The same year, in Jeremiah Johnson, Redford examined a different kind of life, a life worth living, far away from competitive skiing and competitive politics. It was the world of nature, with Redford as a pioneer learning to survive in the wilderness.
You got him, Pilgrim! You nailed him clean! Come on, we got us an elk to skin.
Those are three very good films, and I remember interviewing Redford at the time for an article I called More Than a Pretty Face. This is 20 years ago. He pointed out to me that he was the one that was using his beautiful exterior to show the uncertainty of a man underneath. He hired director Michael Ritchie for Downhill Racer and The Candidate. He wasn't just being a hunk for hire and used by him. Redford, was the storyteller. He held the strings, and he was confident enough in himself, if you think about it, to play complicated, less than perfect characters. Bigger box office success would come later in his career, but this was a great time for Robert Redford. And really, Roger, you and I know there are a lot of hunks in Hollywood who are so scared to death to show cracks in the armor, and he did it early on.
The funny thing is that he discovered something that a lot of the great stars have discovered, and that is, if you really have a good project, you can forget about your image, and if you have a bad project, it's not going to do your image any good, no matter how good it might look on the page. When we come back, Redford's glory years, when he made one enormous hit after another.
Friends like Mark's hooker. You know how easy it would be for one of Lonigan's guys to get you?
Henry, all we need is a couple of days, and we can get the son of a bitch and nail him.
Redford and Newman back again and together again in The Sting, continuing this special program on the career of Robert Redford. The Sting was made in 1973 and once again directed by George Roy Hill, who teamed them up for the first time in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Redford was good in The Sting, but he was coasting. It was a role he could play very easily, and maybe he knew that because he went on to play a series of very different characters in a series of 3 more box office successes. In The Way We Were, also in 1973, he was making 2 movies a year there for a while. He was the handsome naval officer who loved and left Barbra Streisand and then came back again, only to have their marriage fall apart during the Hollywood blacklist of the McCarthy era.
I'm telling you it's a waste. That's what I'm telling you. And that those men and their families are only going to get hurt. And that nothing is going to change. Nothing. And after jail, after 5 or 6 years of bad blood, when it's practical for some fascist producer to hire some communist writer to save his ass because his hit movie's in trouble, he'll do it.
That was his second picture with director Sidney Pollack, who began with him in Jeremiah Johnson and was to become the most important filmmaker in Redford's career. And they teamed up again for 3 Days of the Condor, one of his most underrated films, I think, an intelligent thriller where he played a CIA desk-bound analyst who suddenly found himself in the middle of the action.
Are you on a company line?
No, I'm in a phone booth. I'm just a block away. I'm in the street.
You're in violation of secure communication procedures, Condor.
Listen, you son of a bitch, I'm telling you, I came back with lunch and it was raining and the whole house was murdered. Everybody is dead.
Then came All the President's Men, a movie that forced Hollywood to take Redford seriously as a producer as well as a film star. He bought the rights, he produced it himself with Dustin Hoffman as a co-star in a thriller that was basically about a couple of newspaper guys tracking down leads.
Howard, dear. Hi, I'm Bob Woodward of the Washington Post.
Yes, what is it?
I was just kind of wondering why your name and phone number were in the address books of 2 of the men arrested at Watergate.
Good God.
It was an exhilarating 6 or 7 years for Robert Redford, from the enormous success of Butch Cassidy to the Academy Awards for All the President's Men. And he seemed to move during that period from a good-looking movie star to one who insisted that we take him seriously. All of my life, he once said, I've been dogged by guilt because I feel there is this difference between the way I look and the way I feel inside. Maybe he was still burning from the label pinned on him when he first came to Hollywood. He's just another California blonde, they used to say. That was the famous line that was quoted against him in William Goldman's book about the screen trade. After All the President's Men, there wasn't anybody left who subscribed to that opinion.
Oh, and I think also his best films are about the differences. I tried to say before, those early films, The Candidate, Downhill Racer, the difference between the looking on the outside and what is inside the man. I think when the history of his career is written, that the highest point probably will be what he did with All the President's Men. Because here was a film, I mean, he completely astonished the public by buying this book and making it into a great project. And it was a thrilling film, and I think it also had the impact of solidifying political change that was going on in the country. It's a tremendous achievement.
You know, one thing that we might mention here, as I think back over all these films he made during this period, there's not a single film there in which he plays a conventional romantic lead. Even when he is the handsome guy in the Navy uniform and the way we were, even then, it's real complicated.
And he's not a particularly nice guy.
No, he isn't.
He's a very troubled guy.
So it's almost as if he must have deliberately been turning down screenplays where he would simply be a sex object on the screen.
Okay, coming up next, Robert Redford's career takes him in new directions in front of and behind the camera. Continuing our special show on Robert Redford, there he is in The Electric Horseman, the last film of the 1970s that he would make, another portrait of a glamorous character with a hole in his heart. And kind of like his cowboy character in that film, during the 80s, Redford didn't seem to be taking performing all that seriously. Now we're going to look at sort of the downside of his career after that great burst of energy in the 70s. He would star only in 4 films during the 1980s, preferring to direct and produce and develop his student filmmaking Sundance Institute instead. But for the record, let's consider these performances in the 80s, starting with one of his worst, maybe his worst, in Brubaker, 1980. He played a warden who went undercover to expose corruption within the prison system. But in a terrible concession to his stardom, he wouldn't cut his golden locks in a prison haircut. Can you imagine Robert De Niro doing that?
What's it be, my man? Leave the ears.
Much better was his performance in The Natural from 1984, a dreamy, more life-affirming version of Bernard Malamud's dark baseball story. Out of Africa from 1985, I thought Redford stumbled as an actor.
I don't know that I'd be any good at this. But how would it be if I kept a few things with you?
Next came Legal Eagles, a pointless thriller in which Redford played a yuppie lawyer. Far more impressive was his work in Havana from 1990, in which, with his old friend, director Sidney Pollack, Redford displayed his old daring to play an aging leading man, a broken soul of an American living in Cuba, hiding from past losses and slightly scared of falling in love with Lena Olin.
But sometimes I feel terrible about the thought of being happy with you, because if it weren't for...
No. Don't say it.
Roger and I both liked Havana, and we were in the vast minority of critics who did. It featured Redford as the actor I admire, the glamorous star who dares to play complicated, flawed, and frightened men. I strongly recommend renting Havana and reconsidering it. I think that film was really mistreated when it came out.
It was a good film, and it was underrated. And Alan Arkin, for example, was terrific in it. He should have gotten an Oscar nomination for a supporting role.
Film.
But in general, if you look at Redford during the 80s, what's on the screen isn't nearly as impressive as during that terrific burst of creativity in the 70s. And one reason for that might have been that Robert Redford spent most of the 1980s as involved in political activism as in the movies. We're going to look at his political side when we come back. Continuing this special program on Robert Redford, starting in 1980 with Ordinary People, which he directed but did not appear in, and which won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Film and Best Director of the Year, Redford started branching out widely, very widely, from the traditional role of a Hollywood star. Ordinary People was the story of a troubled teenager who considered suicide after the death of his brother. And it wasn't a flashy movie, but it was intelligent and sensitive, and people were amazed by how well it was directed. Timothy Hutton was the teenage boy, and Judd Hirsch was his psychiatrist.
What do you want? I'll tell you what I want. I want you to leave "I don't know" out there on the table with the magazines, okay?
Yeah, and if I don't have an answer, you want me to make one up?
Yeah, that would be nice. Make one up right now about how there's no feelings in there, no how.
Redford's next work as a director was The Milagro Beanfield War in 1988, based on the novel by John Nichols. It was a film that mixed reality and fantasy in the story of a peasant who went up against a big corporation because he didn't see why he couldn't use their water to grow some beans.
All I know is I'm not going to go north like my dad and pick somebody else's beans for $2 an hour.
Neither one of us gave thumbs up to the Milagro Beanfield War. I felt that the realistic and the magical elements in the story didn't really fit together, but it was an interesting offbeat kind of project to try, and it was typical of a lot of the things that he did during the 1980s. He was living and working during the decade on his famous spread in Sundance, Utah, and from there he began an ambitious plan to try to encourage the spirit of independent filmmaking, by which I think he would mean films that were made outside of the usual financing and distribution channels based in Hollywood. Other people have analysis, he once said, but I have Utah. And from there, maybe he thought that the movie industry could use his kind of therapy. In Park City, Utah, he founded and supported the Sundance Film Festival, which is growing into America's most important showcase for independent films. Such titles as Sex, Lies, and Videotape and Metropolitan were premiered there. And at Sundance every summer, he invited new directors and writers to work with established veterans in writing and filming workshops. Some films that began life at Sundance include Impromptu, the story of the 19th century novelist George Sand, who dressed like a man and broke all of the rules.
I am your slave, and you have summoned me with your music.
Smooth Talk, with Laura Dern's brilliant performance as a young girl seduced by a smooth-talking stranger.
I'm Arnold Friend, and that's my real name, and that's what I want to be to you. A friend.
And A Dry White Season, the story of a black man's murder in South Africa and his employer's attempt to find out what happened.
I will take your case. I will take your case if only to make it abundantly clear how justice in South Africa is misapplied when it comes to the question of race.
It's one thing to try to appear in worthwhile films. It's another thing to try to produce them and direct them. Redford has done all of those things, but when it comes to actually supporting other independent filmmakers on their projects, this star, who doesn't even live in Hollywood, has done more than any dozen industry insiders to put his money where his mouth is. Every summer, unknown would-be filmmakers come to Sundance to work on their projects, and every winter, they and others with the same spirit come to Park City to premiere them. And those two programs, backed by Robert Redford, do more to open up opportunities for unestablished and unconventional movie makers than anything else I can think of by anybody else. A one-man force to really encourage this kind of independent spirit.
You know, a lot of people have made staggering sums of money in the entertainment business, and the stories are full of all the stars who bought land, big pieces of land in California. Now they're worth $500 million, and people say, well,
Montana, they bought a lot of land in Montana.
Wasn't that great? You know, they own land in Beverly Hills or something. George Lucas, with his Skywalker Ranch and changing the way movies sound and special effects, has put the money back into the movie industry, and Redford in the independent area has done the same thing, and these are two guys to be truly admired. Coming up next, we look at Robert Redford now with 3 hit films, 2 as a star, the other as a director. 1992 has certainly been a big year for Robert Redford as star, producer, and director. He starred in the box office hit Sneakers, in which he played a reformed hippie, a renegade computer expert for hire, leading a ragtag group out to save worldwide electronic security.
National Security Agency, Director of Operations, please.
Redford also produced a film in 1992, Incident at Oglala, a well-meaning but dreary documentary about a government scandal at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation.
It might have been Indian versus Indian, but there was traditional people with traditional beliefs versus people who were puppets for the United States government.
But his 1992 triumph was his direction and narration of A River Runs Through It, a rare and fine portrait of parenting.
As a Presbyterian, my father believed that man by nature was a damn mess, and that only by picking up God's rhythms were we able to regain power and beauty.
10.
To him, all good things, trout as well as eternal salvation, come by grace, and grace comes by art, and art does not come easy.
And in this year's Indecent Proposal, Redford starred as a billionaire who offers struggling architect Woody Harrelson $1 million for one night with his wife, Demi Moore. This provocative potboiler was a big hit at the box office, both here and overseas.
You think I have to buy women?
Why me then?
I bought you because you said you couldn't be bought.
Robert Redford seems reinvigorated by the movies and their potential to inform, instruct, and entertain. The American cinema needs more actors like Robert Redford who take the art of film truly seriously.
And he does, and he's been now in movies for a long time, and the returns are kind of in on the probably the great part of his career, although I'm looking forward to him as an old man.
I think he can direct for another 20
Not right away, but in a...
He can direct for another 20 years. I mean, he's got plenty.
Yes, but he can also play older characters, too. One thing that I think we really have to address head-on is the issue of the fact that he's so good-looking.
Yeah, I know.
This is a handicap in our society. I've seen it, and you've seen it. It's really better to look like we look. You get along, you make friends more easily. You get along, everybody, you know, doesn't bother you on elevators. The fact is, somebody who is as good-looking as Robert Redford has his work cut out for him, being taken seriously and being allowed to play roles that aren't simply the leading man. And he has struggled with that over all of these years successfully, and he has overcome it. And I know a lot of people say they'd like to look like Robert Redford. I'm not sure it's a bed of roses, to tell you the truth.
Well, it isn't a bed of roses, but it probably is better than looking like us. That's it for this week. Next week, we'll be back with reviews of new movies, including
Hello, baby!
True Romance with Christian Slater and Patricia Arquette as lovers on the run from the law and the mob. Plus, the film version of Amy Tan's best-selling novel, The Joy Luck Club. That's next week, and until then, the balcony is closed.